Juniper Books presents The Luckiest Man in the World by Molly Cutpurse, narrated by John Crabtree PhD from his notes recorded at the time. Chapter 2.
7th of January 2026. I was awoken by the same sunlight that entered my room through that same crack. I'm not a morning person. Even before I had my work-induced breakdown, that's what my parents called it when they described my condition to my neighbours, the best part of my day would be dozily awake, where my thoughts would randomly cross my consciousness in no particular order. I will admit that that's when I created and solved some of my best work. That morning was no different, and I listened gently to the rain pattering against my windows, while all manner of timepieces were whirling, hands flew against the clock faces at unnatural speeds. Then I heard my sister's voice after 3 knocks on my bedroom door. "John, you awake? Can you do me a favour?" I said, "You awake?" "Yeah, just about. What do you want?" "Do me a solid, will you? Take Benny out, will you? I got a call from my boss and he wants me to go in early this morning. Can you do that?" "I suppose so. Where's Mum and Dad?" "They've left already. The symposium, remember? In Oxford?" "Oh, yeah, okay. Please, you won't forget? If you don't, here's shit all over the kitchen, and you'll only have to clean that up." "I will." "Thanks. See you later." This conversation woke me up properly, and I opened my eyes and then blinked several times to clear the gloop from them. I suppose it might be redundant to say that I'm not an animal person, because animals are stupid and they don't know maths. However, I put up with Maggie's mongrel Benny, I suppose, because he was not only particularly dumb, but he was what I call friendly dumb. In other words, he was bloody useless watchdog. But if you wanted a dog to show how obedient and loyal one was, then Benny would take first prize. My soft sister saved him from an almost certain injection a few years ago, as his elderly owner had died and he had found himself homeless. So Maggie, soft-hearted as she is, adopted him. It wasn't the most enjoyable occupation, taking him for his daily walk, but unlike Maggie, I kept him on his lead, because I had learned the hard way that he did not always respond when called. Therefore, after a coffee and huddling under my father's big old black umbrella, I took him next to the pond where Benny was given his constitutional, and we ended by sitting on an enclosed bench with Benny's nose resting on one of my shoes as the rain pattered around us. Naturally, my thoughts were engaged in the queer stuff that had happened the previous night, and as I sat, I was testing the limits of my memory, wondering who, out of my former teachers and educators, I could ask about what was going on without any of them phoning for them men in white coats. And speaking of which, as I was deep in thought, a man wearing an actual white coat, or close enough to it, was hurrying by. The imprudent man had no umbrella, so he was getting soaked, and I smiled. What idiot would go out in this constant rain without an umbrella? Quite unconsciously, I touched the back of my right hand again. I have no idea why. And the man vanished. Just like that. Gone. Without a trace. He had simply merged or gently faded into nothing. And I actually felt my heart thump as it missed a beat. And it was all I could do to cease to breathe and stare at where he had once been. Yet I was not the only viewer, it seemed, as Benny had lifted his head and barked a number of times before I was able to pacify him by patting his head. Only then did I see the drenched man again, this time walking towards me, just like before, his head down and his American baseball cap offering him little protection from the rain. Taking the same course and direction, he passed me just as he did previously, my attention glued to him as he receded and walked onward towards one of the gates, which he then passed through, leaving me with, as you can imagine, a cluster of unanswerable questions and my brain buzzing as if it was on fire. What had just happened? Benny, realising that we were not going to walk again, stayed sitting, and after looking at me, resumed passively staring at what was before us. It quickly became clear that what had obviously happened was somehow connected with me, the markings, the white creature, and what had happened in my room, and more than that, somehow it had happened to Benny as well. Somehow, this time, I had not only advanced into the past, if I can use that term, but Benny had travelled with me. It was only probably less than 20 seconds, but it had happened. How was I doing it? Last night I had projected myself forward almost 2 hours, and now I could go backward. Honestly, my brain was sizzling. If I had gone backwards less than half a minute, why did I not, well, what word could I use now? Collide with my normal self? And did anybody else see me and Benny disappear for those 20 seconds? Probably not, as the rain was keeping the visitors away. The green space seemed to be reserved for only gullible men taking their sister's dog for a walk, and the odd moron who forgot their umbrella. And yet, as I walked home, perhaps I ought to be grateful for that moron, because only after I had taken off my outer clothes and shaken the umbrella did I realise the impact of what had happened. For however I was doing it, I was really apparently going forward and back in time, and not only that, here I took a deep breath. Whatever was connecting to me, well, that is to say, in that instance, stupid Benny had travelled with me. Benny had travelled back with me. So it was not a shot in the dark to realise that if I held on to him, he would also be able to travel into the future as well, as I did last night. It was seriously too much for me to handle, and as I closed the door of my room with the intention of scouring the internet and my own library for any sort of explanation, mathematical or even metaphysical, I felt that desperate. I so wished my old gullible friend Len was still alive, because he would most definitely have appreciated this. And of course he wouldn't have sent for anybody connected to a mental home either. But then, well, there's a thought. One of about 50 new ones a minute I was having. So what if anybody did? What if anybody locked me away? How might that affect me? That is, if I could do what I imagined I could do. So now my brain took a right turn as it began to indulge in rare flights of fantasy, something which it certainly was not accustomed to doing. Hard facts and explainable formulas, that was the essence of my life. That had always been the way. However, as I stared at my poster of Euclid of Alexandria that I had purchased from the British Museum, and realising how ancient the great man was, this almost broke me, as the question of how far was I able to take this? Was I limited to 20 seconds backwards, or to almost 2 hours forward? This effort of even thinking such questions exhausted and drained me of almost every mental effort, and I fell onto my bed, hardly daring to think of the possibilities. Of course, by now, I was almost certain that it was the white light that had descended from the stars that had to be the cause. Seriously? Just what the hell had that been? And then, as I attempted to quell my thumping heart, in just that single moment I realised that my life was never going to be the same again. It was an extraordinary and terrifying single second that gripped my bones and mind. It was terrifying. My life as I knew it had come to an end, and I felt the world was mine. I had become a giant among men, an individual no longer necessary to obey common rules, a person apart, a gifted man, a superior man, a separate man who had no need to yield or observe any law but my own. Yes, just that one single thought in itself was enough to keep... Sorry. Let's get this right. It was enough to make my flesh creep. I cannot describe how isolated this made me feel. In our given lives, even if we live alone, there always exists some form of connection with those who walk the same path. We have to eat, and therefore we are in some way connected to those who supply our needs. We rely on people to supply fresh water and power to keep us alive. Even when we sleep, we depend on other people unless we live in a forest on a bed made of leaves and twigs. We are all dependent on one way or another on the goodwill of others. Yet, because I seem to be capable of transcending everything that I have ever known, in the most simple terms, where does that leave me? Without help, without assistance, and uniquely dependent upon my own initiative. As I laid on my bed, staring at some inconsequential and nondescript point on the ceiling, I had to be honest. I didn't enjoy what I was feeling. It felt too much, too scary, and too different. Apart from the fact that I had no idea how I was able to transcend time, I will admit to having even deeper and even more petrifying thoughts, such as, did I now have limits? What could be the consequences? That is, if there were such things. How would having this ability affect what few friendships I had? And what about my family? After a while of sweating about these vexing questions, I swung my legs and placed my feet on the floor and sat straight up, feeling similar to how an isolated life form at the very end of time might feel, paralysingly alone and facing annihilation, or a being present at the first few protocells managed to find each other on a barren young earth. So in all seriousness, with thoughts like that, how might I continue my life? For what was I feeling seemed more important than even mathematics. Just how was I to incorporate this unhackneyed gift into my life? A gift? Gifts are for people. And there are 8 billion of us at the present time. So am I unique? Or am I only one of many of that white light touched? And 2 further thoughts. Is this how mankind progresses? Am I just one who has evolved into something superior? And if so, is the ability to go forward and backwards just a further limitation, or did the white light give others some other abilities? Capabilities that I don't possess? My old friend Len would have undoubtedly agreed. But if so, what might these abilities be? The capacity to heal, the potential to travel vast distances in an instant, the aptitude to solve any problem. Or was I letting my imagination run away in the hope that I wasn't so alone? It was only then that I realised that I had a choice. Stay in my room, imagining the best and worst, or descend from my self-imposed elevated position and speak to those that loved me. It was an arduous decision, but I chose the latter. So with immense difficulty I shrugged off the hundreds of questions that were being held in balance and left my bedroom. And by the time I reached my familiar kitchen, I brewed coffee and attempted to act as normally as possible. Yet what had happened to me was absolutely impossible to ignore. I was incapable of dismissing it as I could a raging toothache. All that I could think of was that my life was never going to be the same again. Even if I were fortunate enough to find a position worthy of my mathematical talents, how might that ever satisfy me? I could travel in time. Surely that would supersede anything. and around that word went crashing into other thoughts and spilled the results everywhere. Supersede. That was a word. But what did it mean? How does it connect me from making a living, earning money? For perhaps a full minute my brain came to a relieving halt, almost as if time had interfered in the working of it. And then in that space that seemed to encompass the entire universe, answers began to present themselves. Events that I had previously thought of as problems became solutions, and obstacles became advantages that I began to see a way in which I could live, a way or method in which I could transform this curious ability into something of value, indeed a great deal of value. I think it goes without actually writing it that you may guess that I'm not a practical man. For most of my life I have spent perusing both common and unorthodox formulas, and I have undertaken them in physical comfort, be that at home or at school or at teaching environment. I was never one for the supposedly great outdoors. The most I partake of nature was sitting in my parents' garden or walking by the great pond. I was never one to walk alone in a deep forest or lounge about by the sea. I didn't enjoy rain or snow, and you might easily come to the correct conclusion that I am a thoroughly indoor sort of person. Perhaps you might even describe me as lazy. However, as I drank my coffee, it occurred to me that I might have to adjust to some of those traits if I were to expand this queer ability. Because one thing that was occurring in the manner of my thoughts was probably no different to anybody who had any sort of imagination. And that was, what was the extent of this gift, and how might I use it to gain easy material satisfaction? In common parlance, how could I use this to free myself from the commonplace chore of making money? Because let's face it, that's what I had to do to keep surviving. This gift is not going to change my personality. I could travel to the ends of time and I'd still be a virgin. Not that I care about that. I still wouldn't be able to see properly without my glasses. And as much as I don't want to admit it, people are never going to treat me any differently. I'm never going to command any respect. But it's a possibility that cold, hard cash might. No, that might make people regard and view me differently. I think that could be a mathematical fact. However, amidst this bout of excitement, I felt a characteristic sense of unease based upon what I did for leisure. Perhaps because the seed of that could undo me might lie in ignorance. This issue lies at the very heart of travelling through time, its trademark, if you will. I thought hard about what had actually happened as I sat on the end of my bed. I had mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared 2 hours later. But what if I had gone back 24 hours? To reappear in my room at a time when I knew I had been there? Would there have been two of me? And if so, then would I have remembered it before I had gone back in the first place? Yes, perhaps it wouldn't be such an insane idea to keep the men in white coats just on standby. I will admit this idea freaked me out. Was it possible that there could already be multiple versions of me in all the ages of my body, might become spread across all the time periods that I might possibly visit? Now that was the very definition of insanity. As I cogitated this paradox, I felt how one of the apes from Kubrick's film 2001 might have felt when its intelligence somehow became aware that it was possible to use something about which it previously was not aware. That first moment when a living creature looked to the night sky and wondered, what was its place in the world? Just how frightening must that have been? I was only beginning to understand. Being who I was, basically a devourer of data, I naturally turned to the internet and my fairly decent collection of mathematical and technological books to see if there was any understanding that could offer me any answers. I can tell you now that after a solid study of every scientific paper to do with time, I read of nothing that would even answer any of my most basic questions, let alone my more complicated ones. Moreover, the science fiction literature, books and graphic novels, of which of course I enjoyed so much, offered me no concrete solutions at all. Which is not at all surprising, as in the world of science, travelling through time is impossible unless one is prone to believe the most avant-garde thoughts of the quantum world, a world with as much similarity to the real world as kindness is to my father. Yes, on paper, using the most obscure formulas, it was possible for a tiny elemental particle to seemingly travel back in time, but no scientist of any gravitas would stake their reputation on it happening in the macro world. Well, perhaps a tenured, dusty old professor working in his or her study might consider such a proposition, but the idea would not be considered mainstream. Therefore, after an entire evening downloading whatever subject I imagined might be of help to me, I finally closed my books and my search engines and did what I did when all this began. I stared at the inexplicable dark marks on my hand and the poster of Euclid of Alexandria, wondering if his brain had once shattered in the same way as mine was doing, let alone to even mention any other great contributors through the centuries that had advanced our understanding. Any person possessing a minuscule amount of education would know who they are. No, it seemed as if I were on my own. The layout of time itself lay like an undiscovered country, a place to which no person had ever travelled. As you may imagine, I did not feel like an explorer. I never had, and I expect I never will. Not with any confidence anyway. Yes, that's it. Think of me as a timid and unwilling explorer. Yet I managed to snap myself out of my ennui. What was I worried about? Just because I had two unusual occurrences didn't yet mean the world was going to crack in two. Didn't mean that I was going to break the space-time continuum. Didn't mean our planet was going to leave its orbit and go crashing into the sun, therefore destroying all life. I frowned at myself once again in the mirror in my wardrobe. No, how could anything I did destroy the fabric of time? That is, if it existed. Briefly, it crossed my mind if Einstein had ever had thoughts like the one I was having. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he imagined his theories becoming real. Perhaps he thought or foresaw how his thinking might somehow change the world. But obviously that didn't stop him. Think of the hundreds of thousands that had died as a result of this thinking. Think of how his work had changed the world, and even now, 100 years later, contributing to science. But I would be the first to admit that I am not he. I certainly do not stand on his shoulders. I'm barely tall enough to touch his shoelaces. But, all the same, I appear to be doing something that he and just about every great scientist declare is impossible. And I mean travelling back in time. Because I'm not ever going to consider going to the future. How the heck can that exist? If it does, then that means we are nothing more than puppets. No, I refuse to fill my mind with that sort of thinking. This particular day was coming to a close now, and it was dark outside. My watch told me it was close to midnight and the house was silent. I'd heard my sister arrive home and my parents had retired early, so I was the only one still awake. I supposed now that it was quiet, I could try again. As the question of meeting myself was paramount, I decided that, although I didn't want to do it, I made the decision to go back an hour. And just in case I might meet myself, I stood in the corner of the room, a place where I knew I had not stood during the previous hour. You will not be surprised to learn that I was anxious. I placed my bedside clock where I could view it, and still unsure of what to do, hugged the corner and began to deliberately press the figures on my hand as the white man had shown me. I suppose I had only done that twice when I stopped because something had happened, even though I wasn't able to see it. Then I saw it, because my clock was not in the place where I had placed it. I found it on my bedside table, which was its usual place, and moreover saw it read close to 11 o'clock. But of me, there was no sign at all. Now think of that for a moment. Just where was my one self an hour ago? A self that I knew had to be in that room. I'm sure you can understand my confusion, but I bet you can't feel how bizarre I felt. What did this mean? With an effort, I brought myself back to close to 12 again, and this time I saw the clock materialise. So it looked as if there could only ever be one of me. I appeared to be unique. But was that a positive thing or not? What if I had done something really unconventional during that last hour, created or thought something rare? Would that result of that still exist? I'm babbling words, but oh my God. By now I was overloading myself with so many questions that the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. And that confusion began to exhaust me. I enjoy a good puzzle, but this was too much, and I needed sleep. Even after I closed my eyes, my brain would not shut down. I even imagined that time was not a subject that our brains handled well, and I could feel the torture happening in the space between my ears as I ever so slowly slipped into sleep, only for me to violently awake 3 hours later, sweating profusely, with an understanding of everything. That was some thought. And staring into the blackness of my room, I had no misgivings, for I knew I was right, because it was all a question of perspective. Just like Mr. Einstein had written, everything was about my point of view, and nothing existed that was not. A grandiose claim, but I knew I was right. There was only one point of view in the entire universe, and that was mine, which meant that only one of me could exist, no matter where I went, well, at least in this universe. And from the depths of my memory, in my half-asleep brain, it passed up a long-forgotten religious idea, one from the Jewish faith. He who saves one life saves the world entire. Consumed by this thought, which was oddly relaxing, I fell asleep again, understanding that I possessed the knowledge to more fully conduct an investigation into this strange gift that I had been given. I felt I had the right, and now those marks, those 10 inscrutable marks in the form of a square. And so, in yet another dream, where the white creature appeared, I finally understood what they were. Minutes, weeks, days, months, and years, with one to return. 8th of January 2026. However, when I awoke the following morning, the delights and assurances that I had felt before I slept felt as weak as a thin breeze, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing what had taken place, but not feeling it at all. My state of mind was not improved by Zoe, who hammered on my door, informing me that breakfast was ready. Therefore, I was thrown straight back into the world that I once thought was so normal. Father was reading his paper and complaining about some sporting event. Mother looked harassed, but I didn't know why. Maggie was painting her nails and Zoe was fretting about her grades. This was most definitely a family who possessed no cohesion. Eventually, my father placed his paper aside and glared at me. So, employment? What have you done recently to obtain some? I'm with 2 agencies, Father, just waiting on them. I can't conjure up a job if none is advertised. Then perhaps you ought to lower your sights. For the time being at least, moping about here all day isn't good for you. And no, before you say anything, it's not about earning an income, it's about maintaining your self-worth. Taking Benny for a few walks every day doesn't exercise your mind. I do a lot of thinking when I walk him, Father. Perhaps, but that is hardly the point. What you need is sustained work that will make you feel proud of yourself. Maggie sniggered and I glared at her. So you'd have me working flipping burgers then? You go too far, John. Take me seriously. Perhaps he needs more time, Douglas, said my mother. More time? He can walk and talk, can't he? He's capable of anything we can do. I'm just saying that he ought to get out more, and while he's at it, find some form of employment to keep him occupied until a proper position, using God knows what talents he possesses, comes his way. I can't see anything wrong with that. University students who are close to taking their finals occupy their time doing menial jobs. If that's what you want, Father, I sign up for some regular agencies. Good. That's more like it. It won't do you any harm. When I was younger and attending university, I took on a part-time position clearing tables, and that didn't do me any harm whatsoever. You may be some sort of a genius, lad, but you'll find out sometimes that's just not good enough. Even your old friend Einstein did a normal, boring job. The moment he mentioned Einstein's name, I wanted to put him right, telling him that there was a great deal of difference between being employed as a patent examiner and grilling burgers, but I knew that would only fan the fire. My father, the brilliant Dr. Douglas Crabtree, MD, was an intelligent and talented surgeon, but he had a short fuse when it came to matters that was outside his level of expertise. The only way I could best him in a discussion was to bring mathematics into it, a subject that was not his forte. With that at an end, breakfast was finished in silence, except for when Maggie talked to Mother about how she ought to make more of an effort to find a decent local hotel for her and Sam's wedding reception. 1,041 words wasted there. Why did I bother counting them? What a useless activity. After my parents and Maggie had left for work, and Zoe had taken Benny for his walk and then left for school, I was left with a dilemma. What was I going to fulfil my verbal contract with my father, or just stay at home? This was what occupied my mind as I loaded the dishwasher. Now, it may seem odd to you, but I have to say that since I become encumbered and embroiled in the minutiae of daily family life, the notion that I now had the ability to do odd things to time had kind of lost its edge. Yes, I could hardly believe myself when I returned to my room to take a shower and dress. Yes, of course I was going out. Mrs. Blob would arrive soon, the daily help. And I could be sure of one thing more commonplace than gravity. That word would get to my parents, that their odd son had been in all day. Her name wasn't really Blob. That was just a cruel nickname Zoe had given her because she looked like one. Seriously, Mrs. Glass was a woman who was dangerously overweight and unfortunately possessed a sort of two-faced personality a person has who is always on the defence. Hence she was helpful and could take instructions from my parents, But the truth was she couldn't stand me or my sisters. We suspected jealousy. As I put on a clean shirt, part of me still didn't believe what had taken place in the kitchen. The commonplace had washed away the fantastic. Whereas last night I had become a superior being capable of altering time, now I had been reduced to being a nerd looking for a job a monkey could do. I remembered it all though, but somehow the emotion and the intent had disappeared. And the truth was, I was too depressed to try it again. It was so much easier to do what my father instructed me to do. Just get a minimum wage job, one where I didn't have to think. Nodding to Mrs. Blob, I apologise, before I left. I took the Central Line to Bank Station, and when I stepped up to the street level at the corner of Threadneedle Street and Cornhill, it was crowded as I remember. Not knowing exactly what I was going to do, I leaned on a railing and watched the rush of people and traffic pass by before it fully occurred to me that time was passing. Each step I took time. Each revolution of a wheel took time. Then I became aware of the trillions of atoms making up the air, people's bodies, stone and metal colliding with each other, creating what was before me. How is it possible for me to consciously alter each and every one? How did I do it last night? My books on quantum reality were vague and crude. But that was only because scientists still could not agree on what exactly reality was. But somehow, I had the feeling I knew. Catching reality was like trying to take a fish out of water and still expecting it to survive. Like the old sages said, if you point at it, then it doesn't become it anymore. Because it is in the very finger that you use. I then became certain, as I still am, that the only thing that could touch, let me call it reality, was human consciousness. That is why the process worked last night. Of course, what the white light had to do with it initiating me, I still had no idea. A shadow fell across me and I turned ever so slightly to see a well-dressed young woman standing beside me. She had a sweet, heart-shaped face, and holding her iPad, she was alternating between jabbing at it in the way a demented monkey might and staring at the busy junction. She stood close enough for me to see that she was using the map app, but what really caught my eye was her attractive gold wristwatch, which looked so new and shiny that it caught the sun and glinted. Just by glancing at her clothes and shoes, I was able to see that the watch was probably not a knockoff. There were a couple of £1,000 hanging there right off her wrist. That was the moment I froze as a preposterous idea took hold, and I used that word with confidence. Not being a stranger to sci-fi and fantasy books and films, including time travel, what shook me was that I hadn't thought of it before. Maybe the thought of it, actually using time travel to make money, didn't occur to me because the idea in this real world in which I'm living in was just that. Stupid. Except now I was not living in the real world anymore. Or rather I was. But now it had just become far more fluid. And then I smiled as quite a few scenarios from various fantasy films came to mind. And the more I remembered, the more I smiled. Mad and desperate ideas about using time machines to go back and make mountains of cash. I stood so still that any one of the commonplace multitudes passing me must have thought I looked bonkers, staring into the road, sporting a wide, fixed grin. Excuse me, are you all right? The woman with the iPad had ceased to jab at it, and breaking away from my reverie, I turned my head to see her expression of concern. Her forehead, over a wide blue eyes, furrowed, but not in an ugly way. Instantly I returned my mouth to its normal shape and nodded. Oh, fine, thanks. Just thought of a happy idea, that's all. Must have been a doozy. You're American. From New York. I say, can you help me? I can't make out this map at all. London's so weird. Where do you want to go? Where's the Paris? From her bag she took out a pamphlet. Ah, yes, Cheapside? Oh, easy, it's that long road over there. That's Poultry, and Cheapside is a continuation of it. Thanks. Weird names, don't you think? Cheapside and Poultry? They're really old names for the businesses that used to take place there hundreds of years ago. People bought meat from Cheapside and chickens from, well, you get the picture. Actually, close by there's Bread Street and Milk Street. Listen to you. What are you? You work for one of them London tour operators? No, I was just born in London, so I know it pretty well. I'm a doctor of mathematics, actually. Well, so does that explain the idea you just had? Kinda. I like it when ideas come to me. While staring at the road. Sort of. Where are you going in Cheapside? It's a bit of a long road. The church? St. Mary Lee Bow? My great-grandparents on my mother's side were born close by and were married there, so I told my family I'd snap a picture or two. Are you in London long? Oh, just a few days. Just stopped over on my way to Berlin. I'm a translator, and there's a 6-month job waiting for me. Have you been there? No, never been. I'm not that fond of air travel. Actually, I've never been out of England, although a place I'd like to visit is New York. Oh, that's a shame. I went to Berlin about 10 years ago and I loved it. Fantastic nightlife. Are you going straight back after your job finishes? Are you inviting me to spend a day walking around London, giving me the benefit of your knowledge? Well, that sounds like a plan. I'd be happy to. I still have no idea why I said that. Although I could very well see that she was attractive, I had no pretensions about getting to know her better. I suppose I thought that speaking with an American for a while could be interesting. Well, listen, here's my number. Text me and I'll text you back. I'm Caroline. John. Well, nice to meet you, Caroline. You'll find the church up there on your left. She smiled as she replaced her iPad in her bag. Thanks. See you later then. Good luck with your job. She smiled again and turned away, leaving me feeling queerly elated, easily as when I discovered I had moved through time. Women didn't act like that around me, and our conversation flowed so easily. What was it about that American woman that speaking to her felt so easy? I watched her light blue trouser suit and her blonde hair move effortlessly through the crowd, but lost her as she began walking along Poultry. However, her diminutive size and overall adorable bright face remained with me. So unaccustomed was I meeting anybody new, let alone a beautiful woman, that she threw me completely of what had occurred to me. Ah, yes, making money by way of time travel. And here I must readily admit I had no original thoughts at all of how it could be done. I had a raft of screenwriters and novelists to thank for that. Needing a place to think, I made my way to St. Michael's Alley off Cornhill, where one of those delightful small and fully enclosed green spaces existed, just to the rear of the church. When I worked in the city for a few months, it had become a favourite haunt of mine, for it's so peaceful and sitting there, you'd never believe that you was only 50 metres away from a frenetic, busy London. There are so many of those ancient public places around the area that if I had the money, I would live there if I could. Oh my God. Perhaps one day I might be able to. I bought a coffee and a croissant, found a seat, took out my own iPad, which I considered to be more important to me than my mobile, and smiled ruefully to myself as I relaxed, enjoying the quietness. I suppose never in a million years, as those screenwriters and authors were plotting their films and novels, that some out-of-work doctor of mathematics would one day use their ideas for real. What was it that someone once said? This is just a penny, but put it in the ground and wait 2,000 years and it will become priceless. How about buying an original Harry Potter book and keeping it in mint condition? How much would that be worth in 2026? My eyes opened wider. Perhaps in 2045. Or even further along. What if I bought an original Constable or a Turner? Screw the Harry Potter book. Anything by those painters would be worth millions. I will admit once again that I felt queer as I had these thoughts. It was all very well in theory, but this isn't a film or a book. What actually would I have actually have to do? Take Turner, for instance. I'd have to go back to whenever he lived, if I can go back that far, find him, give him the asking price of money for the time. Where would I get that? And then bring it back here. And then I'd have to have some sort of providence. I couldn't exactly snap a picture of him with my phone as he's handing it over to me. And where would I say I got it from? And would it pass any of the tests? After all, it would only be maybe a day or two old. The paint might still be wet. Would it pass radiocarbon dating? Is that what they would do? The last thing I'd want is for it to be labelled a forgery. But then what would they do? Throw me in prison? All I'd have to do is travel back to before the prison was built and I'd be free again. But then, no, most of that was poor thinking. I'd buy it and store it safely and then retrieve it once I'm back in good old 2026. Simple. Seriously, I was unable to write fast enough and my brain hummed, comfortable in the peace and quiet, even though a few office workers were also enjoying the private green space. But as they consisted of young women, mostly in twos, they sat on their benches and talked quietly as they munched their sandwiches and drank their lattes from their cardboard cups. That is, until I felt a presence standing in front of me and recognised a comfortable and informal American drawl. Hi there. Again. I knew who she was even before I took my eyes off my iPad and looked up. It was the American lady, Caroline. She was perhaps typically American, but in a way that was hard to explain. This time I noticed that her blonde hair was on the short side, allowing her long gold earrings to sparkle. Her makeup had been applied expertly, and she had wide and engaging coral-coloured lips. She wore glasses that looked super thin and expensive, and the lenses, like her eyes, bore a soft tint of blue. And how could I not mention her round, soft face? Hi, small world. Caroline? You remembered, and you are John. Mind if I join you? Please do. Did you find St. Mary Le Beau? Yeah, no problem. That's a fantastic church, and I got some great pictures. Did you know they give lunchtime concerts? Listening to that was so cool. Yeah, many do. This one here does occasionally. So this is a coincidence. Yeah, I was just wandering, as you do, and discovered the alley and the trees. So this is where you come for inspiration? Looks like you've been inspired a lot. I glanced at my scribbles and closed the pad. Yeah, I love this place. There are lots of others, but St. Michael's, I don't know, feels just right for me. It's only crowded at the moment because it's lunchtime. By 2 o'clock it'll be empty again. It's beautiful. You'd hardly believe you could be in London. I know New York pretty well, and I can't think of any place like this. And if there was, it'd be packed all day long. So this is your day job then? Sitting in the park thinking new ideas? Well, that would be nice if it were true, but the truth is I'm out of work at the moment. I was due to begin a really good one, but I got sick and lost it. Nothing serious. Well, it was for a time, but I'm in recovery. Today I'm in London, actually, to find any job just to keep my parents off my back. You still live with them? I had to when I got sick. When I came out of hospital, I had no place to go. How about you? I have a small apartment on the east side, and when I'm away, I short-term lease it. After a few more minutes talking, she bought a coffee and returned. Yes, she actually returned. And for the next hour and a half, we chatted constantly on so many subjects, and I was surprised at how quickly the time went. We spoke about nothing especially heavy or too inquisitive, but by the time she looked at her watch and said she had to go, I knew more about her during that short time than I ever did with any of my informal lady friends. I guess the American in her brought out the English reserve in me. Whatever it was, I felt regret when she stood and reminded me to call her. Before she finally walked away, though, she offered me her hand and I took it, making my handshake as firm and as masculine as I could. It was then that she said something odd, for she looked at me closely and even leaned in a little as she touched my arm. I know we will meet again. I hope so anyway. I will admit, it seems as if I'm always admitting something, that returning to my jumble of thoughts about how to make money from time travelling was hard, but not impossible once I read my notes. But I will admit that Caroline never left my thoughts. Along with one other thing, for as I threw my paper wrapper and my own cardboard coffee mug in a bin, Caroline's smiling face occupied my mind again, except this time it was accompanied by a dark and almost threatening feeling, a feeling I had felt before that time in my parents' garden when I found myself staring at the light in the night sky. Yes, my old friend Paranoia. Why did she ask me for directions in the first place? And surely that was no simple coincidence arriving like that at St. Michael's. Moreover, why would such an attractive and well-turned-out woman choose to speak to me for so long? Somebody like her? Well, I mean, she could have had her pick at talking to anybody, but she stayed and talked to me. And wasn't that conversation so easy? Perhaps a little too easy, and maybe too well rehearsed? These thoughts set off feelings of panic that steadily increased until I took the train to return home. Normally the crush would have made my condition worse, but somehow that day it felt comfortable. I had a seat next to the doors, and ever so slowly, after I closed my eyes, I surreptitiously took deep breaths and managed to calm myself by the time I reached my station. All the same, I was pleased to reach fresh air and familiar surroundings, and I'm glad to say that when I reached home, only Zoe was in, and she was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework. Hi, John. What's simultaneous equations? I just don't get them. It was good for me to rest a while and help my younger sister Joey. She was bright, easy as clever as Maggie, but whatever the gene that made me, it definitely hadn't been switched on the female side of the family. My mother, also a doctor, was by far cleverer than me in terms of memory retention, but her daughters, like her, approached mathematical problems with difficulty. Zoe was 15, and from what I remember about being that age, seemed typical enough. She liked music, played the violin at school, and was into Japanese anime in a big way, much to the annoyance of Mother, as her favourite was gore anime, which Mother considered far too bloody and violent for a young teenager. It was difficult to give a reason, but when a girl of her age prefers to stay in her room drawing horror-soaked drawings rather than being out with girls of her own age, there is a clue. After helping her, I went to my room and laid on the bed trying to come up with a lie to tell my parents as to why I still remained unemployed. I had managed to remember the names of a few agencies so I could tell them that I'd spent the day filling out forms. Only then did I return to the question that was banging around in my head. If not Harry Potter, or buying an original Constable or Turner, how could I turn what I seemingly can do to my advantage? I looked again at my notes, and some were doable, but some bordered on the crazy. 1. Go back and open a bank account with compound interest. 2. Go back and buy virtually anything of value and bring it forward. 3. Go back and get Shakespeare's autograph. 4. Go back and take 4K photographs of famous buildings being built. 5. Go back and get a famous person's DNA. 6. I found myself staring and reading the list with an ever-sinking feelings as my intellect began to pick holes in each one. Take Shakespeare, for instance. A quick search on the internet told me that only 6 copies of his signature are known to be authentic, and all are found on legal documents. And really, even if I could send myself back that far, how would I recognise him? Would he understand me? Would I understand him? Under what circumstances would I persuade him to give it to me? And that's not even thinking about the actual danger to me. I mean, to visit a foreign country, you would have to have shots for immunisation. What sort of viruses and other diseases would there be against which I've no protection whatsoever? And what if I brought just one disease back? Just one, perhaps on the sole of my shoe? How could I be responsible for introducing, say, smallpox or the bubonic plague to the 21st century? I all too quickly realised that this was not going to be so easy. I'm guessing that going back more than, say, 100 years would give me all sorts of problems. And I'm not even mentioning the obvious ones, such as altering or screwing with timelines. And then to make matters worse, I began pondering about what could happen to me. Could I really see myself walking around Victorian or Tudor London, not knowing how to speak to anybody, being unaware of their manners, foibles, acceptable dress code, and expect to get away with it? Which took me to more questions. Where on earth would I get acceptable clothes that would pass? Where would I get acceptable currency? I was never one for history, as my old school reports would show, so how would I know if I was doing something out of the ordinary? But at least I had the intelligence to realise that even if I had a PhD in, say, the Georgian area, I doubt if I would be enough for me to go about my business in everyday life without bringing attention to me. I am only able to live my life here in relative ease because I was raised in this time, and I am aware of all the infinitesimal things and actions that may be acceptable, and that does not cause suspicion. Back there, wherever I went, I would be like the proverbial fish out of water. Just how long would it take for me to get into trouble over probably some minuscule misconduct? Not very long, I'm guessing. What if I was caught taking pictures on my mobile? What if I were attacked and it was stolen? How could I open a bank account if I had no address? When did banks begin to demand personal information? I didn't know. How was I to buy anything if I didn't have the correct currency? And how was I to get close to famous people? Did they have the equivalent of bodyguards like they have today? The more I thought about anything that came to mind, the more impossible, or at least highly improbable, becoming successful back in another time sounded highly unlikely. I could foresee problems with my own safety, problems altering the timeline, problems unintentionally bringing back highly contagious diseases that might decimate today's population, not to mention the idea that it was possible that I, and this is the worst possible scenario I could imagine, might even lose my own life. Who was it that wrote that the past is a dangerous land? Where had I heard that? As I lay on my bed, I felt like those early men who had invented the atom bomb. At university, I had read that before they exploded the first one, the code name for the first one was called Trinity. Most of the scientists hadn't a clue how powerful it was going to be. They constructed this thing on a wing and a prayer and hoped for the best. And look how it turned out, because we almost destroyed ourselves back in the 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only difference here is, with me, is that I had an ability that was orders of magnitude greater in potentially destructive power. What if I went back, put in any time you like here, and by accident bumped into somebody, delaying them for a few moments, and this set off a chain reaction in his or her life, meaning they did or didn't do something that was meant to be, and this in turn caused a child to be born on another day who then led an entirely different life, one in which they played a huge part in human destiny, or not? What if that child was a boy whose destiny was to become Jack the Ripper and whose women were not murdered? What if they had lived and produced children, one of whom had a child who became a politician and changed Britain's history? When I returned, would the world be the same? Would it be better or worse? Would it be here at all? There was no computer in the world that was able to predict the outcome just because I had bumped the shoulder of one person. But there again, perhaps no change would have happened at all. Talk about a time bomb. But then that bloody white light came to mind again. Undoubtedly, it was that gave me this ability. So what does it mean? If only I knew why, I might get an idea of... I just didn't know. Whatever was done to me didn't come with an instruction book. So what the bloody hell was I supposed to do with it? Did it come from aliens with the intention that I would destroy life as we know it? Did they give it to me so I would do their dirty work? So when I came back from 1764, I would be only one of a few persons to take care of because of a dangerous plague that had decimated the world's population. But as I rested on my bed, I ran these arguments through my original idea that I had in my power, the ability to get all that I wanted and perhaps even more, unlimited money, a nice place to live, nobody to disturb my work that I wished to do, in my own time, and in place with nobody ordering me about and telling me what to do. By this time it was late and properly dark outside. I could hear my family talking, heard Maggie's laughter and Sam's deep voice, getting on better with my father than ever I managed to do. They must have realised that I was in. How nice it was of any of them to call me for dinner, but I didn't feel like eating anyway. What I have thought of I found depressing. What the hell was the point of endowing me with such fantastic ability if I ought not to use it? Just what was the point of me travelling back from meeting Shakespeare and getting him to sign something, only for when I arrived back in 2026 to see the world as a smoking mess and aliens sucking the water from the oceans? Yes, I know that sounds like science fiction, that I saw it as a distinct possibility. I know. I've watched too many films. Yet my problems came to an abrupt halt as I fell asleep wearing my clothes, and was rudely awakened by Zoe, shaking me awake.
You have been listening to an audio production of The Luckiest Man in the World by Molly Cutpurse, narrated by John Crabtree PhD.